Hello again, this is Aaron Bland with Your Rules, Fantasy Sports Your Way. For the last several weeks, I've been writing videos and articles on how to prepare for your draft and ways to make fantasy football even more interesting. One of those ways is my recommendation to expand your rosters beyond the norm. I think this is especially important when it comes to quarterbacks, which are always the most consistent point scorers of any fantasy team. If you get bad ones, you're almost certainly sunk. Think about it. When was the last time you saw someone win a fantasy championship with a lousy quarterback? Now, in standard one-quarterback leagues, I feel the value of quarterbacks gets a little diminished. You could afford to wait several rounds in to grab one, knowing that there isn't a huge difference in the top dozen or so. Now, if you have to start two, the position becomes significantly more valuable, and you have to consider the top passers sooner in the draft. Waiting too long could ensure you end up with someone like Alex Smith as a year-long starter, a scenario that would be a nightmare for anyone. Let me add something to this. Even for those of you that are going to be staying in your comfortable one-quarterback league, the in-game substitution feature being offered this year with Your Rules will still raise the value of quarterbacks. That backup you normally select at the end of your draft to be a bye-week filler could now become a crucial week-to-week contributor if your starter is stinking up the joint. That's the beauty of the in-game substitution feature, something you aren't going to find anywhere else. Now, let's get to it. Here are my top 10 fantasy quarterbacks of 2017. So, let's start with number 10. Ben Roethlisberger. Now, Big Ben would probably rank higher in this list if it wasn't for his habit of missing a handful of games each year with various injuries. His value is always extremely obvious when this happens because on the weeks he isn't there, the Steelers' powerful offense goes right into the tank. Fantasy studs Antonio Brown and Le'Veon Bell are completely dependent on Roethlisberger being behind center. And speaking of those two, having them at his disposal makes Roethlisberger a very attractive choice. He managed to toss 29 touchdown passes in just 14 games last season. Now, Big Ben flirted with retirement in the offseason, and he certainly isn't getting any younger, so that injury risk always remains. However, taking him in the middle rounds of the draft could turn out to be a steal. I think he's still got a little bit left in the tank. Okay, number 9. A little bit of a surprise here, Marcus Mariota. Now, I'm definitely higher on Mariota than the other talking heads. I see him as a dynamic player that had a 95.6 passer rating before fracturing his fibula last season. The real story is how the Titans have made a concerted effort to improve the weapons around him in the offseason. They added Corey Davis in the draft, 5th pick, who could turn out to be the true number one receiver talent that Mariota has never had. Now, on top of that, they even traded up to take speedy wide receiver Taywan Taylor in the 3rd round. Now, Mariota has a lot of protection and support with an outstanding running game behind him and is going to add 300 to 400 yards a year himself on the ground. Now, while your fellow fantasy owners will be reaching for someone like Russell Wilson, I think you can get superior production out of Mariota several rounds earlier. So remember, I told you it's all about value. All right, moving on to number 8. Kirk Cousins. Well, the Redskins evidently still don't know what to make of Cousins, as they refuse to offer him a long-term contract. Fantasy owners, though, are really starting to have fewer doubts, as the guy tossed for almost 5,000 yards and 25 touchdowns last season. Assuming the team doesn't sign him to a long-term deal before the season, Cousins may be motivated in his final contract year heading into free agency. However, the Redskins haven't done him any favors surrounding him with elite talent. Mediocre receivers and running backs pepper the roster. Their biggest weapon, Deshaun Jackson, was allowed to walk via free agency, replaced with converted quarterback Terrell Pryor, a player even the lowly Browns didn't think was worth the money. Cousins also has the honor of facing the second toughest schedule against the pass this season. My personal opinion is to let someone else overdraft him. Moving on to number 7, Philip Rivers. Okay, here's a name that I also have much higher on the list than most people. The fact is, Rivers has more going for him this season than he had in many, many years. Even last season, when he lost Keenan Allen early and had no one else to throw to, he managed almost 4,400 yards and 33 touchdowns, which were better passing numbers than Andrew Luck. Instead of planning for the future by taking another quarterback in the draft, the Chargers decided to upgrade everything around Rivers instead. Now, let's not forget that Rivers was pressured an unbelievable 147 times last season because of his horrible offensive line. That was easily the biggest factor in the 21 interceptions he threw. The good news is that the line has been a major focus and has been upgraded through both free agency and the draft. Now, Rivers already had a great young running back behind him in Melvin Gordon, and in the draft, the Chargers managed to land a big dynamic receiver in Clemson's Mike Williams. And don't forget that Keenan Allen will also be a full go for training camp. Taken in the later rounds of your draft, Philip Rivers could pay off huge. Number 6, Cameron Newton. Now, after his monster 2015 season, Newton was the first quarterback off most draft boards and proceeded to lay a very, very large egg. Now, while never the most accurate passer, his completion percentage fell to a dismal 52.9% as he took a huge beating both in the backfield and every time he took off to run. Now, as a result, he ended up torpedoing the season for many of his fantasy owners. Now, fortunately for him, the Panthers were paying attention and have not only upgraded their offensive line, they have added 2 dangerous rookies, Christian McCaffrey and Curtis Samuel, players that can take it the distance every time they touch the ball. And let's face it, no one runs the ball like Cameron Newton. Even injured last year, he managed to rumble for 359 yards and 5 touchdowns. So while he was overdrafted last year, he could end up being a bargain in 2017. However, one thing to keep in mind is he's recovering from surgery on his throwing shoulder, which could end up affecting him early in the season. Number 5, Andrew Luck. Also coming off shoulder surgery, Luck is somewhat of a risk here, but he's fully expected to be ready for Week 1. He wasn't quite himself last year, evidently stemming from a shoulder injury he received in Week 3 all the way back in the 2015 season. The fact is, he gets hit a lot back there, taking 41 sacks in 2016. But even with a bum shoulder, Luck still managed over 4,200 yards and 31 touchdowns, which illustrates just how good the guy is. The prospect of a completely healthy Luck is very intriguing, as the last time he really felt right, he threw 40 touchdown passes back in 2014. As usual, Luck will also reward his fantasy owners with a few hundred yards rushing and 2 to 4 touchdowns on the ground. Just keep in mind that because of his leaky line, he carries more of an injury risk than the QBs ranked ahead of him on this list. All right, moving on to number 4, Matt Ryan. After 3 straight seasons of throwing 28 touchdown passes or less, Ryan exploded with just under 5,000 yards and 38 touchdowns last year. Buoyed by explosive running backs and perhaps the best receiver in the entire league in Julio Jones, Ryan finally put it all together and walked off with the NFL's MVP award. Now, offensive coordinator Kyle Shanahan left to be the head coach in San Francisco. So there definitely is some concern that new offensive coordinator Steve Sarkisian can keep the train rolling. But the Falcons insist they are not going to fix what isn't broken. Ryan led the NFL with 17 passes of 40 yards or more last year, and the Falcons play the 3rd easiest schedule against the pass this season. So honestly, it's really hard to imagine a significant drop-off for Matt Ryan. Number 3, Drew Brees. While it looked like he may be slowing down a bit after the 2014 and 2015 seasons, Brees attempted a ridiculous 673 passes and racked up over 5,200 yards and 37 touchdowns last year. He may be the best pure passer the NFL has ever seen, as he makes seasons like that routine for him. Now, there are signs the Saints want to slow down the game a little bit by running the ball a bit more, and the acquisition of Adrian Peterson is a sign of that. I mean, however, at some point you simply can't pass on taking Brees. While I don't see him duplicating last year's numbers, the perpetually poor Saints defense assures he'll always be near the top of the league in pass attempts. Number 2, Tom Brady. The ageless Tom Brady continued his revenge tour in the NFL last season, tossing for over 3,500 yards and 28 touchdowns in only 12 games, while only throwing 2 interceptions. The Patriots offense is so perfectly built around him. It doesn't seem to matter what cast-off receivers or running backs join him out there in any given year. Brady rarely gets sacked and often ends the game with a perfectly clean uniform. As is the Patriots' style, Brady will be joined with a completely new backfield and a new free agent weapon in Brandon Cooks. Someone owner Robert Kraft compared to Randy Moss. He faces one of the top 10 easiest schedules against the pass this year. He's quite simply one of the safest picks in the entire draft. And he also won't be missing any games this year with silly, bogus suspensions. A big plus. All right, in my number 1 quarterback for 2017, Aaron Rodgers. Now, after a bit of a down year in 2015, Rodgers bounced back to elite status with a vengeance last year, tossing 30 touchdowns in his last 11 games. He ended the season with over 4,400 passing yards and 40 touchdowns. Now, on top of that, he added 369 rushing yards and another 4 touchdowns on the ground. The Packers have no dominant running back, and the coaching staff loves to throw around the goal line. In his prime and with the 5th easiest schedule against the pass, Rodgers is my pick as the safest choice as the top fantasy quarterback. One of those few quarterbacks that's worthy of being taken in the first round of your draft. That's your top 10. If you'd like to get a little more in-depth breakdown, plus my rankings of the other 22 quarterbacks, just head over to yourrules.com and check out my articles. I'd also like to remind everyone to like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. And by doing so, you won't miss out on any of the news, tips, and advice from all contributors. Your Rules will also be the exclusive fantasy provider at Tony Romo's National Fantasy Football Convention in Dallas in July. Now, this is hosted by ESPN fantasy analyst Matt Berry, and there's going to be 50 current and former pro football players and personalities that'll be participating in 3 days of football events, exhibits, parties, photo ops, tailgates, contests, and more. You want more information on that, head over to gonffc.com for more details. Now, with its patented in-game substitution feature, Your Rules is poised to set the fantasy football world on its ear this year. And it all starts at the NFFC on July 14th. I really hope to see you there.